Hi everyone, this is a short slide set in regards to some other tissues I wanted to talk about. I will have already talked about epithelial tissue. We'll be discussing connective tissue in the next set, but thought I'd go over some of the other tissues, this being a lot smaller sort of presentation. So, we talked about epithelial, we talked about connective tissue, but we have to remember, of course, there were two others that were the big ones, which was nervous tissue and muscular tissue. So I just want to talk briefly on those two. Obviously, in Clinical Anatomy 1, we'll be spending a lot more time on muscle tissue. And then in semester 3, there is a neuroanatomy course where you'll be spending a lot of time talking about nervous tissue. So when we look at nervous tissue, we're thinking of the brain, the spinal cord, and what are called peripheral nerves. And those are the nerves that are either sending out messages to muscle or sending back message from the skin and other structures from a sensory perspective. Within this tissue, we find two types of cells. Remembering, when we look at tissues, we think about cells and extracellular spaces between them. So there are two types of cells in nervous tissue. There are what are called neurons and neuriglia. Sort of see them here in their configuration under a microscope. So neurons first, of course, are the cells that are responsible. They transmit signals between the brain and the spinal cord. And they're all about the central nervous system. So, the brain and the spinal cord we consider to be central nervous system. All of the nervous tissue outside the brain and spinal cord is said to be peripheral nervous system. So these cells are responsible for transmitting signals between the brain and the spinal cord. We can see that there are a number of structures here that make up this neuron. And something to think about is that this length here from the axon to the axon terminals here can be considerably elongated. And for example, the nucleus can be in the spinal cord, and then this long extension could run all the way down to the muscle involved in your big toe, for example. So fairly long length for a signal to travel. Neuriglia support and take care of the neurons. So these neurons need to be supported, and the glial cells do that, and they stick to them. And we can see them here. How these are microglia we see here, and oligodendrocytes. These all help stick, connect, hold these neurons into place, and then of course support them. We see them here as well. Here is the neuron in the blue, with the axon extension here, and these neuriglia you can see are helping support and hold things in place, maintaining their position to each other. And because you're going to see that there is going to be conversation between neurons, and they need to be relatively close to each other in order to have those conversations, which we can see here. Muscle tissue, of course, we've already talked a little bit about in the other course. They shorten or contract. So when we talk about a muscle tissue shortening, we call that contraction. And of course, as we've talked about in the other courses, contraction results in the movement of bones at joints, which can result in us being able to run, jump, throw, whatever we're doing. We do call the cells in muscle tissue fibers because of their shape being elongated and almost hair-like. We've already talked before that there are three types of muscle tissue in the body. We have skeletal muscle, we have cardiac muscle, and we have smooth muscle, which we can see here, sort of representing the three different types. Skeletal muscle, of course, is what attaches to the skeletal system itself. So skeletal muscle will find attachment from bone to bone, or at least one attachment to bone. And of course, this tissue is responsible for allowing us to sit in a chair, stand up, and walk and move, run, throw, and jump, as I said. As I said, we'll be going into this much more in depth in Clinical Anatomy 1. Smooth muscle, also known as visceral muscle. This is what we find in the digestive system, the urinary bladder, and blood vessels. It does have different responsibilities depending on what organ it's in. In blood vessels, the smooth muscle there is responsible to dilate or constrict the diameter of the vessel itself, so making it either larger in diameter or smaller in diameter. Intestines, it moves material through, so it has a particular type of contraction called peristalsis, which takes food materials and forces those food materials to move from proximal, meaning right at the stomach, to distal, eventually dropping into the large intestine, where then, of course, further processing occurs, moving this material along until eventually we need to defecate and get out of our body the leftover products of digestion. And bladder, it is the contraction of smooth muscle that allows the urine to expel out of the body. And you do get a sense of how strongly this smooth muscle does contract the bladder as to the type of force that urine has when it's expelled out through the urethra. We see it here. It looks a whole lot different. We don't see the striations. We can see it sort of squeezes in on itself. So when we talk about smooth muscle, which will be talked a lot more in clinical anatomy too, when you're looking at organ systems, especially the digestive system, you can see that it's the relationship to each other that results in the kind of responsibility it has. For example, we see here in the stomach, there are actually 3 layers of smooth muscle. And this is what allows that sort of squishing, churning action that occurs in the stomach that helps spread the acidic material produced by the lining of the stomach to break down materials that are in there. Cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. It is the muscle that's responsible for the heart squeezing when it contracts, and therefore calling it a pump. The cells fit tightly, and there's a lot of sort of coordination and specialization that allows the cells to have very quick, good communication between themselves, which results in a rapid conduction of stimulus through the heart, which is contraction. So we wouldn't want the heart to slowly move through contraction. That would really end up in not it being a pump at all. It wouldn't be coordinated enough. So these open communication systems in cardiac muscle, which we'll be talking about when we get to the cardiac system, allows for the action potential in the heart to move unbelievably quick so that the heart looks like it's contracting as one, which we see here nicely, the configuration as to how muscle tissue wraps around the heart, creating the pump. We see how there are these connections all the way through. And one of the modifications I sort of was relating to of a couple of others is what are called intercalated disks, and these allow these muscle cells to communicate and allow an action potential to travel extremely rapidly throughout the heart. Told you it was short. Thanks very much. And the next slide after this will be on connective tissue, and that'll be it for this week.